Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Symposium for Friday, July 11th. We are recording this a couple days early. Tomorrow is the Berlin conference of the Schiller Institute, which is really part two of the conference which occurred in Newark, New Jersey over Memorial Day weekend. And I'm letting you know that this was pre-recorded in case there has been some major development that we don't address here, but there is a major development in that the West is completely bankrupt economically, physically, and morally. And we saw that with the still more to be located number of deaths caused by the flood in Texas, which is well over 100 people at this point, maybe over 200 or more by the time that you are seeing this. And this is completely unnecessary. And I think it's criminal that we had already at the end of 2024, the horrific flooding in Asheville, North Carolina, which killed about 200 plus people. And somehow we cannot seem to address these problems. Now, I have been making a big deal of the fact that this is the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America, the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. And our nation seems to have lost its way and forgotten the principles under which we were founded and the economic policy, the vision that people like Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon LaRouche had for the future of the nation. So what I wanted to first do is to go to a clip of a speech. We have just the audio, and it'll show an image of the Oahe Dam, which was dedicated by President John F. Kennedy in 1962, and I think it will give you a sense of the unfortunate difference in outlook of the leaders of our nation today.
Remarks of the President at dedication ceremonies of the Oahe Dam project in Pierre, South Dakota, August 17, 1962.
Secretary Udall, our host, your distinguished governor, Governor Guy, and to recently my associate at the White House, George McGovern, Secretary Vance, members of the House and Senate, ladies and gentlemen. I want to express my great pleasure and to tell you what a privilege it is to leave Washington these days and come out here to South Dakota. And I can think of nothing more beneficial for those of us who work in Washington, in the nation's capital, to leave on occasions and come out and see the people of the United States. These dams, these great projects, frequently are statistics to those of us who work in the nation's capital. And I can imagine nothing more beneficial to any American, to any member of the House or Senate, to any member of the executive branch, to any citizen of this country, than to come here to South Dakota and realize here in this state and in this country there is being built the largest dam of its kind in the world. It is a source of pleasure to me as president, therefore, to come here on this occasion. And I think it's very beneficial for us to realize how frequently the American people have worked together to provide this kind of great benefit. We are 180 million different people with very different ideas on what we should do and how this country should be run and where we should go and what are our responsibilities and obligations. I think it is important that we recognize how often we work together to accomplish great results. And this Missouri River Basin power system, these lights going on and off, bring to our attention the remarkable progress which we've made in one generation in this country in lighting the West, in bringing the benefits of science and technology to the people who live in this part of the United States. These are benefits which are made available to all American citizens. There could be no view of this country more erroneous than members of the Congress or of the executive or the citizens of different states to believe that what happens here in South Dakota is important only to the people of South Dakota and is a matter of indifference to the people of New England or California. I can imagine no better way than for this country to stand still if that should ever become our viewpoint and our mentality. What happens in this basin helps all the people of all the country. What happens in the east helps the west. What happens in the south helps the north. This country would not have achieved the highest standard of living in the world, the largest productive power, if we had been merely 180 million different people. Instead, free and independent, and yet willing to work together, we've accomplished this. And we're going to accomplish all the other great tasks that lie before us if we are to achieve our destiny. So I'm glad to be here. And I wish those who come and visit this country from abroad would come here. They come to New York and to Washington, and they feel they've seen America. They should come here and to Montana and to California and to Boston, Massachusetts, and then they would see something of the United States. This dam will produce enough electric energy, this one dam, to light the city of Edinburgh in Scotland. This dam alone will supply enough irrigation area larger than the nation of Luxembourg. This dam and the rest of the dams on this river, which 30 years ago would have provided only floods and darkness, now provide irrigation and light. And though those of us who are here today follow in the footsteps of those who made it possible, we share a satisfaction and also a commitment that we must in our time make it easy for future presidents of the United States and future citizens in the 1970s and 80s to visit projects like this, which have been planned and carried out in our day. Water is our most precious asset, and its potential uses are so many and so vital that they are frequently in conflict. Power versus irrigation, irrigation versus navigation, navigation versus industrial, industrial versus recreational. Here in the Missouri Basin, the supply of water cannot meet all of these needs all the time. Accommodations are necessary. And in 1944, under the administration of President Roosevelt, a comprehensive Missouri Basin plan was authorized to accomplish all of these great objectives. This is the fifth of 6 great dams to control the main stream of the Missouri River. And I can assure those of you at the upper end of the Missouri and our good friends at the lower end that it will continue to be our policy to regulate the storage and the flow of water in these reservoirs in the most advantageous manner for all concerned that the best engineers in the world can devise. And I must say that I am heartened to come out here and talk to the distinguished engineer in charge and be informed by him that this has cost $25 million less than was estimated 8 years ago, and that stands as some kind of a record in the United States today. We're going to take him back to Washington and put him in charge of the whole operation. We take for granted these miracles of engineering, and too often we see no connection between this dam right out here and our nation's prosperity and our nation's security and our leadership all around the world. The facts of the matter are that this dam and many more like it are as essential to the expansion and growth of the American economy as any measure that the Congress is now considering. And this dam and others like it are as essential to our national strength and security as any military alliance or missile complex. When we are inclined to take these wonders for granted, let us remember that only a generation or two ago, all the great rivers of America, the Missouri, the Columbia, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, ran to the sea unharnessed and unchecked. Their power potential was wasted. Their economic benefits were sparse, and their flooding caused an appalling destruction of life and of property. Then the vision of Theodore Roosevelt was fulfilled by Franklin Roosevelt. And to demonstrate how important this is as a national issue, two distinguished American presidents from New York State saw how essential it was to the nation and New York State to develop the resources of the West. And as a result, this nation began to develop its rivers systematically, to conserve its soil and its water, and to channel the destructive force of these great rivers into light and peace. And today, as a result of this, the face of this nation has been changed.
So, quite different than what we have heard from any recent president, I have to say, about the future. And with that, I will introduce my guests here this evening. Bruce Todd, millwright, retired from New Jersey, former candidate for lieutenant governor, and I think for other offices as well. Cal Smith, engineer, joining us from the West Coast, who knows something about these matters. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Cal right now. So Cal, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Please go ahead. I can't hear you. There you go.
I'm happy to be here. And I also might comment, if anybody ever makes it to the Oahe Dam in Pierce, South Dakota, that the fishing just downstream of it is really quite good. At any rate, I wanted to have a look at the Texas Hill Country floods that occurred on the 4th of July, which I would call a kind of a perfect storm. And the reason for that is that the hill country of Texas is an area of limestone hills and clay soils that runs from the border between New Mexico and Colorado, in Texas, and runs southeast across the state into the ocean. Here you see a view of what the Guadalupe River in Kerr County, Texas looks like. This is not far from the location where not just one, but two girls' summer camps were wiped out by the floods. This is another view somewhat downriver. You can see the high bank on one side and the low bank on the other. This is an area that is agricultural, has many small towns in it, and many people use it for recreation, and you can see why. This is a view of the Guadalupe River near Hunt. This is a town of, during the winter, the population of this city is 1,300. During the summer, it can go to as high as 4,500 or 5,000. The night of the early morning on July the 4th, there were many RVs pulled into an RV camp right on the shores of the river, downriver from Hunt in Kerr, and many of those people are still missing. The death toll is still rising of confirmed dead. To give you a sense of how this works, at Hunt, the river flow is normally 23.1 cubic feet per second. Just downriver in Kerr, some experts estimate that the flow, when the flood occurred, as heavy rains had occurred up in the upper ranges of the valley, instead of the National Weather Service's forecast of 7 inches and their storm and flood warnings that they issued, the rainfall ended up being 12 hours I'm sorry, 12 inches, falling in about 2 hours. This created a wall of water that went shooting down the river that in some places was as high as 35 feet. The flow went from 23.1 feet per second, cubic feet per second, to as high as 149,000 feet per second, which exceeds the flow of Niagara Falls. For example, the height of the river gauge in Kerrville was 32.4 feet when the flood went by. The day before, it had been 0.18 feet. That is 2 inches. This is a picture of the flooding in Hunt near Kerrville on the 4th of July. And you can see that that river has become very, very wide. The Guadalupe Valley has fairly frequent flooding. This is a picture of the Memorial Day floods that occurred in May of 2015. This is a picture of floods that hit the region in 1998. This is although it's difficult to read, this is a picture from the Texas Water Development Board of property and crop losses of life and injury between 1996 and 2021. The total is, you can see here, 96 dead, $1.4 billion in lost property losses in 2022, and almost $21 million worth of crop losses and damage in 2022. In other words, this counts up all the years between 96 and 21. So this flooding phenomenon was well known. Now, some infrastructure was built. You can see, for example, that reservoirs have been built. There are 10 levees, 220 dams. Now, those dams can be small farm dams or larger systems. And in fact, there's a large dam that creates Canyon Reservoir, which is downstream of the area that hit the most flooding. And there's 815 low water crossings. But one of the things that strikes you about the infrastructure in this county is that even though the National Weather Service was able to issue flood warnings on the 3rd of July, late on the 3rd of July, Kerr County, which is where most of the damage occurs, does not have an emergency warning system. The way these warnings are supposed to work is the National Weather System issues them, and then the local authorities are supposed to distribute those warnings, either through sirens or cell phone or radio alerts. The county fathers had tried to get an early warning system funded in 2010 and were turned down, in fact, earlier than that, and were turned down every year they submitted it to the state by the State Emergency Management Agency. The Guadalupe Rivershed, as you see, runs all the way from, it has 2 forks up on the far west of it that actually cross the New Mexico border. They come together north of Kerrville and Hunt, and then it runs down that reservoir there in the middle is Canyon Lake, and then it runs through New Braunfels down through Victoria, which is one of the pictures I had of flooding down into the Gulf of Mexico. This is although this picture isn't as clear as the other one, it shows where the Guadalupe Valley is in Texas, and it shows that the basin covers about 10,200 square miles that are drained. Now, we've seen that they built a lot of dams, and there may not be, because of the low limestone bluffs, there may not be a place where a dam could be built that would hold all those floodwaters back. And because of the agricultural and recreational uses of that river and industrial uses, it may not be practicable to build, say, a 40-foot high levee along each side of the water to run right along the banks all the way to the sea. However, we know that many parts of the West are suffering under terrible drought right now. And if you look at these two maps here, for example, the one on the right, which has, you can see the border of Texas, you'll notice that the Guadalupe River crosses one of the proposed canals that would be built for either the NWAPA system, the North American Water and Power Alliance concept that the Schiller Institute has been including in their documents and their proposals on policy for the US, and another policy proposal, what's called the Grand Policy. That one possible idea that we may want to investigate is to build reservoirs, diversionary dikes set at a certain level, so that if the flow comes in higher than those levels, you could have the water go over those dams into great holding reservoirs, and then put pumps in those reservoirs, which could be fission or fusion powered, to pump the water by pipeline into some of these proposed canals to build up the water supply of the West. Why, as President Kennedy said, why not take advantage of the energy and the power that the water can provide and use it for people in other states? So here again, you see a more clear map, and you can see exactly where this river, the Guadalupe River, runs. This is a map made by the Parsons Company in 1964, and you can see that we can pump these many acre feet of water right into this system. This also, building something like this would be a fantastic training ground for training the cadre of young engineers, skilled technicians, meteorological scientists, artists, and musicians that we need to move the country forward. And then I include my references here. The current administration has proposed drastic cuts in the National Weather Service, and more important, in weather research, and also to the Corps of Engineers. These are policies that won't make the situation better and should be stopped and should be reversed, nor will it work to hand over the infrastructure, water infrastructure, over to private hedge funds, because you simply don't make the rate of return that the hedge funds want on their investment. So with that, I think we should look at it, as the Chinese say, we should look at this crisis as an opportunity to take the many flood plans and studies that have been made of this river valley over the last 25, 50 years, and turn that into reality and a part of a national commitment to rebuild our nation's physical economy. And with that, I'd like to hand this back over to Diane.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to bring up Bruce, who I'm sure has some thoughts. One comment I have immediately is this whole question of cost effectiveness. And I have a good friend, Richard Trifon, who came in, I think, as a private consultant for the New York City subway system, which has been in pretty rough shape. And he said, when they do these studies, they never estimate the cost of not doing it. What was the cost of not building the infrastructure, or the cost of not building the outer harbor gateway storm surge barrier that I want to build in the New York, New Jersey harbor? But Bruce, what thoughts do you have, having seen this and heard Kennedy?
Well, I had worked on a number of infrastructure projects, not so much on flood control at that scale, but for example, I worked on the project for Newark Airport, where there was constant flooding of the airport runways and that. And what was done was to build a canal basically around the entire airport, and a levee on the Hudson River side and what's called the Arthur Kill. And the purpose of that, and a series of floodgates, was to allow water to be flood water accumulating at the airport to push the floodgates open and escape into the Arthur Kill in between New Jersey and Staten Island. Now, a problem occurred because if in conjunction with a rainstorm and flooding, you had high tides, which could happen either from normal tide flow or from surges from storms, and the floodgates would then get locked closed. Consequently, the flooding would reappear on the airport side. So what we then did was we built a series of what's called Archimedes screw type pumps, so that in the event that that situation occurred, you could turn on the pumps and pump the water over the levees into the Arthur Kill. So at that point, basically, you've eliminated the causes, all causes of the flooding at the airport. I also worked on what at the time was the largest sewage disposal plant, which was actually right next to Newark Airport. And it covered what previously was a series of sewage plants covering different towns, different counties. And they consolidated that into one huge sewage facility called the Passaic Valley Sewage Disposal Plant, which at the time was the largest in the world. Basically, if you took ocean liners and buried them in the ground, you can get a picture of what these tanks for sewage disposal would look. They were huge concrete structures, some of them 8 or 10 feet thick walls at the bottom, gradually becoming less, up to maybe 3 foot at ground level, but basically a couple of football fields long. And in fact, because of the swamp area and the water pressure, they had to be anchored to bedrock, or else literally they would pop out of the ground just like a boat would out of the water. So that basically you're talking of a similar type of thing in conjunction with trying to get rid of flooding on rivers. As Cal had mentioned, you can do diversion into reservoirs. You could build dams, you could put levees in. One other thing I thought would be of interest was, number one, out in the West, because of the droughts, you don't have a lot of vegetation, which would help hold the water. So that's one of the things that could be accomplished. The other is, I had thought maybe work that had been done previously on atmospheric ionization, where in areas of drought, they've found that they can actually draw water out of the atmosphere by using ionizing the atmosphere. My thought was, in the event where, say, the Weather Service can see a situation where you've got a series of thunderstorms with that potential for devastation to occur, that you could actually start to draw water out of the atmosphere well ahead of the areas where potentially you could get that kind of rainfall, and basically atmospherically upriver get rid of that. I don't know right offhand. I know I talked a little bit to Cal earlier the other day, and I don't know if there's anything he might want to add. We had discussed a couple things, but Cal may have some other thoughts on that.
Well, actually, I wanted to address something that Diane said right before you came on, Bruce, was this question of cost-benefit analysis.
Mm-hmm.
By law, when an agency like the Corps of Engineers does an analysis of a dam or a water control project, they have to consider the potential risk for loss of life, and then they have to consider the potential for property damage. Now, one of the problems the Corps probably is having in the Guadalupe Valley is that it's a low population density area. So therefore, a quote unquote 100-year flood would have a low risk of drowning people, even though we can see that calculus didn't work so well during the last events. The other thing they're required to look at is loss of property. Now, a rural area like the Guadalupe Valley with small towns is going to have a lot less property damage. I think, in fact, I showed you that one chart that showed it was, I think, $1.2 billion worth of property damage between 1996 and 2021. So in a low population area with relatively low real estate values, the way that the law reads now is those areas are going to tend to get less federal support for projects than, say, building or improving an emergency dam in Southern California, where you might have 2 million people downstream of the dam or 4 million people downstream of the dam, and the real estate that could be affected may be $50 billion or $100 billion or even more. And you get to see one of the hidden dangers, I think, of hedge funds and the enormous amount of speculation that's going on now in the U.S. economy, rather than productive enterprise, because it skews projects away from some of the most productive agricultural and recreational areas that we have in the country. And now with the Corps of Engineers facing 15.3% budget cut in the next budget, which was passed, that situation will only get worse. So as citizens, we have a lot of work to do to educate our fellow Americans and our elected officials on what a productive economy means. I'd like to hand that back over, I guess, to Diane or Bruce at this point.
Thanks. Well, I'll bring everybody up. Yeah, what an economy means. Also, I wanted to get back to something Kennedy said, which reminded me very much of George Washington's farewell address, because he takes up the whole question of unity of the nation, that it's not one part of the country against another. He said 2 presidents from New York. He was referring to Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Also Van Buren and Millard Fillmore apparently were from New York as well. But they didn't see this project as being something that was just about the Oahe Dam or the Texas project. It's not about South Dakota. It's not about Texas. It's about the nation. The Erie Canal. Well, the canal was built in the state of New York, and because the federal government at the time wouldn't fund it, it was paid for by the state of New York. But what did it do? It opened up the entire heartland of the United States, the Great Lakes region, Detroit, Chicago, for development, for manufacturing, for industry. So we tend to get very silly debates, especially now, where people have some kind of confusion of a libertarian idea that if the government did nothing and everybody just looked out for themselves, everything would come out okay, which is just, it just doesn't work like that. Go ahead.
There's actually a clause in the 1860 Confederate Constitution which outlaws the federal government for building large infrastructure projects, except for navigation works. Now, people may recall that the Confederacy lost the war. And one of the reasons they lost it was that they couldn't build a productive economy. It was a slave labor policy. It wasn't an advanced labor policy. And they lived primarily on industrial handouts from the British, including their ships. So these British free trade ideas don't function in the real world, and we see that the Texas Hill Country floods are simply a microcosm of what's happening to the entire U.S. economy at this point.
Exactly. And there's going to be more. I fear for the East Coast, where we are very densely populated and we do have a lot of property to be damaged. We are not prepared. We've done nothing serious since Hurricane Sandy to address this. And I think, Bruce, what you were saying about the Newark airport or about this Passaic River business, I had no idea we had these kind of tanks underground. I think it's Tokyo that has this massive, gigantic container underneath the city where the water can go. But there's not a mystery to where water goes. That's why the Army Corps of Engineers was able to map out virtually every millimeter of the whole country. It flows due to gravity. That is, you can predict where water is going to go. You can create models and know what's going to happen with it, which is why it seems to me to be so very absurd that we don't build the infrastructure to manage it. And the other thing that Kennedy said, he talked about electrification. He said this dam will provide the electricity for a city the size of Edinburgh, Scotland, I guess he was talking about. And the recreation, right? It was the thought for future generations. And what you don't see at the end of that speech, it was about twice as long as what we played, as he talks about the Soviet Union being in the process of building a dam in Siberia somewhere, which is going to be larger than any dam in the United States. And then he says, now we don't only want to be first in space, but we should also be building. He doesn't say they shouldn't be building the dam. He just says, well, shouldn't we have a bigger dam? You know, it was a kind of fun spirit of friendship and camaraderie and competition in that way.
Can I just mention one thing? We had a prior discussion after the flooding that occurred in New York City a couple of years back. And one of the things that I brought up in there was a technological innovation that NASA had done. The purpose they had for it was they didn't want their launch pads melted during the huge fireballs that occurred with the space shuttle takeoffs. So they had a pump designed to pump water into the launch area, huge pumps. They actually, and you think about this, you have all this flooding down in Texas, seems like a huge volume of water, but the pumps that NASA designed could pump 1 million gallons of water a minute. Now, just think about that in regards. So if you had something like that made applicable to flood areas, you could actually move huge volumes of water away from flood areas into reservoirs or canals or whatever. It's just a matter of looking at what's the requirement and then coming up with the technological solution for it.
It also shows you that these things, you know, nothing is just a priori a resource or waste. It completely depends on what human beings make of it, right? For example, petroleum or raw crude, whatever, crude oil coming up in a field 200 years ago would ruin your farmland. You would not consider that a resource. But then, because of the development of heat-powered machines and combustion and certain understandings, suddenly this thing became a resource. We saw it in the Tennessee Valley Authority, where the water was horribly destructive. You had it sweeping away all the topsoil. You had swamps and floods, malaria, typhoid, complete backwardness and impoverishment. But then you build 27 or however many dams around the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the next thing you know, this thing, which is a scourge and so destructive is a great resource, providing electricity, beautiful scenery, parks and recreation, fishing, and it becomes a great and treasured resource.
Yeah, and another thing to point out is that many of the dams in the U.S., for example, the infrastructure that was built in the Guadalupe Valley was completed in the 60s or the 70s. And many of the large dams in the United States are now 60, 80, 100 years old. Lack of maintenance is plaguing many of them. And right now on the West Coast, there was a very large and important dam near Klamath Falls, Oregon, that provided much power and irrigation for the dry land there to become productive farms. And that dam was just removed. And there is growing now fervor to remove the 4 lower dams of the Snake River in Idaho. Those dams had created ports where the vast agricultural production of Idaho and Washington State could be shipped down the Columbia River to sea. Now there's talk of removing those dams and somehow pasting together a series of windmills and solar farms to replace the energy that would be lost. It won't work. So it's absolutely correct that water and power infrastructure and a reflection of the technological optimism and commitment to developing the population isn't simply an issue in the Guadalupe River Valley in Texas, but it is, in fact, a reflection of our national commitment to the right to develop and to develop our own country.
What is the rationale for removing these dams? I believe we actually tore down 80 dams under the Biden administration.
Yeah, well, there's a number of, actually, some of it's kind of bogus. One of the objections that is being raised against the existence of these dams, which in fact is correct, is that many of them are past their design life. And so they either need to be removed or replaced. Well, no one wants to come up with the money or the credit, national banking credit, to replace them. So what they do is they just remove them. In the case of the Snake River Valley dams, this is even more, in my view, more hypocritical, which is that the Republican senators there are working very closely with a man named William Ruckelshaus, who you may have heard of before. He was the first head of the EPA under President Nixon. And Ruckelshaus has a environmental council, the Puget Sound Environmental Council, which provides free legal advice to people that decide to challenge dams and to take these things down. And if you go to the Senate, the senior senator from Idaho's website, he finally caves in and agrees that for only $30 billion, they can remove all these dams and make it a free running river. And he says, but we've done the research on this. And in fact, the biggest danger to the salmon, which people are talking about, is not the dams. It's ocean acidification, changes in the acidification of the ocean. Dams have nothing to do with that, but we're going to tear them down anyhow. So, wow. And then it turns out that he has a nice consulting job waiting for him when he retires with a renewable energy company. Probably no connection, but it's really important for us to rekindle this idea of national unity and what it means to build a physical economy. Because we keep running into this with elected officials. They just don't get it. And as Diane's correctly pointed out, and anybody can tell you, there'll be more floods and more disasters. In fact, ironically, the camp that was wiped out, one of the camps that was wiped out on the Guadalupe River is a very exclusive camp, Camp Mystic, where women of the social status of Barbara Bush were camp counselors when they were teenagers. So this was a camp of the daughters of very wealthy people that make policy. This kind of thing may have an impact on their view of what needs to be done. And our work, the Children's Institute, the LaRouche organization's work on making consistent proposals, consistent, well thought out, and developing creative proposals on how a physical economy works, the connection between science and infrastructure and physical economic health are just going to be all that more important.
Exactly. Well, that's what we should be doing. And it is absurd that the United States is not working with the BRICS nations right now, where they've just signed a memorandum of understanding to build at long last the transoceanic corridor from Brazil to Peru, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This would bring nothing but benefit to the United States, but instead we see it as a competition. President Trump is saying that he's going to split the BRICS, which I think is a little bit like King Canute talking about stopping the waves from coming in. As Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said, you're not going to, it's now well over half of the world's population involved in these projects, and you are not going to stand, King Canute is not going to stand in front of that kind of an anti-colonial movement and stop it. But the danger of war and other kinds of what kind of desperate measures will they take? And I think, again, I keep stressing the 250th anniversary of our republic, because we should seize back our identity, which would be celebrating the end of colonialism all over the planet. We would be a great partner of that. And we'd have to have a really crash program to create a workforce that could be building these things. Bruce, from your union experience, might have some idea what goes into apprenticeship programs. And I think we'd have quite a task ahead of us to create the workforce. But I think the direction changes on a dime. And if you have the optimism and people know it's going to be done, people will radically change their lifestyle virtually instantaneously to meet the challenge of doing something productive. And a not so insignificant benefit of going in the direction of productivity again is that you would have wages that mean something. Inflation would go down, and lo and behold, younger people who today have absolutely no prospect of owning their own home, starting a family, thinking anything for the future except being a debt slave, that also could change. And I think it would just make an incredible difference. So, Bruce, maybe if you have thoughts in wrapping up or anything you want to say that you think we didn't get to, please go ahead.
Let me just bring up what you had started to mention on education, because when I went into the Carpenters, it was a 4-year program. It's now a 5-year program. I was more directed towards the carpenter end of it. Along the way, I decided I wanted to go into the millwrighting, which it's hard to imagine, but probably along the way, I probably gained at least another 10 to 15 types of different education that was required for my just general productivity. Along the way, if you worked on a different type of project, you would have to learn what you needed for that project. And when that project would be completed, you would move on to maybe something that was entirely different as a project. So you would have to learn what was needed for that project. So it was a constant educational process throughout the 40 years that I worked in the industry, all types and different kinds of industries, from power plants, refineries, pharmaceutical plants, chemical plants, infrastructure projects. So it was enjoyable to constantly learn something new. So that's about what I would say with that, because giving people a chance to do that will really, create the positive attitude that people really need. Okay.
Good. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for being here. And Cal, what thoughts do you have?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking about this South American Railroad you were talking about. I mean, here we have the Chinese who are developing rail to open up the interior of Asia and with the Russians. And we have the Peruvians and the South Americans building a rail across their continent to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific to build their economy. Well, I don't know about you, but that sounds remarkably like the Abraham Lincoln plan to build railroads across the US in the 1860s to link our coasts and to develop the interior. So it seems to me that we've actually begun a process of recruiting the Chinese in their own way and the South Americans to the same economic view that we had that built the United States. We should be ecstatic. As you said, it opens up enormous possibilities for development and could really help turn the corner on the, for example, you can start with a project to rebuild the Bronx. You've got a whole bunch of undereducated kids, and you've got a whole bunch of old infrastructure and really old buildings that really aren't suitable for human habitation. So create a 4-year program where the students start, it's sort of like engineering, maybe the 4th year could be on the ground, where you take these buildings, you find temporary housing for the people in those buildings, you knock the building down, you design a brand new one, it's state of the art in the same place, you put it back in the same place, and you allow people to live there. And with that kind of training, the children, the college students that were involved in doing that are then prepared to do things like be trained to develop the moon or be trained to develop infrastructure projects anywhere in the world. So the gnashing of the teeth over countries building infrastructure, in my view, is just completely misplaced.
I agree. And on the Bronx, for the record, I know you don't mean this, but they're doing a horrible thing in Midtown Manhattan with a bunch of the projects, which actually they're taking the ones that are in the best condition and demolishing them because they want the real estate, and they're going to just move all the people out of there. So to be clear, we mean the same people that you move are going to live there in the state-of-the-art building.
Yes. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about what used to be called Negro removal back in the 60s or the 70s. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about rebuilding habitable cities and training cadre of youth to be the skilled engineers and the construction workers to learn how to do this.
Right, precisely. Well, I really want to thank you also for joining me and discussing this today. And now I'll just say that I would like everybody to tune in tomorrow. July 12th and 13th is the conference of the Schiller Institute being held in Berlin, Germany. Man is not a wolf to man. It starts, I believe, at 10 a.m. European time, which would be 4 o'clock in the morning East Coast time, or 1 a.m. Cal, your time. But it's going to be live streamed, and the videos will be available, and you can tune in at any time and watch the live stream or otherwise. I also want to encourage people to visit the LaRouche organization website at thelarouche.org. Print out copies of our literature. There are leaflets at quite regular intervals that you can take to meetings to intervene. And we also have a beautiful new pamphlet that we want people to distribute. And as always, if you sign up for a monthly donation of $10 per month or more, you will get the Executive Intelligence Review Daily Alert and Weekly Journal. It's a fantastic deal and a fantastic resource. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be talking soon.